Thank you, Rachael Wong Sall.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting us to appear today. My name is Rachael Wong, and I am the CEO of Women's Forum Australia. With me, I have Sall Grover, the CEO of women's networking app Giggle, who has herself experienced acute harm from laws that conflate sex and gender. She is here today to help represent all the Queensland women who have found themselves shut out of consultation on this bill. This bill has provoked strong emotions, with the Attorney-General outright dismissing women's concerns as transphobia. Not only do such comments embolden violence against women, I can assure you that if she had taken the time to actually meet and engage them in genuine dialogue without derision, it would be abundantly clear that there is no ill will towards trans people. I believe that those engaged in this process sincerely care about their fellow citizens' safety, well-being and dignity. That those who support this bill are truly wanting to improve the lives of transgender people, and that those who don't support this bill are deeply concerned about the harmful, far-reaching implications for all Queenslanders, but particularly for women and girls. While behind this bill may be the best of intentions, these implications have not been fully understood, because if they had, this bill would not have been put forward in its current form. With that said, I ask that you put yourselves in the shoes of our society's most vulnerable women, who will be most adversely affected by this law. Opposition to this bill is not a face-off between women and trans people, but rather a universal recognition of the importance of single-sex spaces and the risks that biological males can pose to women and girls. The rationale for why we have single-sex prisons, bathrooms, changing rooms, sports, and so on, is based on an understanding of the biological sex differences between men and women, and the value placed on protecting and progressing women's dignity, safety, fairness, and equality. Single-sex spaces are particularly important for victims of male-induced violence and trauma. Just because someone does not identify with their biological sex does not negate its existence. A law which allows anyone to change their legal sex because of a perceived gender identity is based on a falsehood. It enables any male to self-identify as a woman and access female-only spaces, services, sports, opportunities, and even lesbian events, and undermines the very purpose of single-sex spaces. It disables critical sex-based data collection, and it opens up loopholes for predatory men to exploit the system and gain unfettered access to vulnerable women and girls. This point was made recently by the UN in its critique of Scotland's similarly controversial bill, which was deemed so problematic by the UK government, it has just used an unprecedented veto power to block it. Despite the Attorney-General's claim that there is no evidence trans women pose an increased risk to biological women, the actual evidence tells a very different story. The reality is, trans women are biological males, and in addition to data showing that they retain male patterns of violence, examples of women being harmed by them in female-only spaces abound. This past year, we have heard of trans women raping women in female-only prisons, hospital wards, and shelters. Sexual assaults by trans-identified males in female-only spaces are becoming disturbingly more common. But even one, the violation of one woman, should have been enough for self-ID laws worldwide to be abolished in an instant. Self-ID laws affect the rights and safety of all women and girls. I have had mothers and fathers tell me their daughters hold on to go to the bathroom all day because they are too scared to use the school bathroom with boys. I have had women contact me saying that aged care workers are required to dress biological men in female underwear and makeup as part of their sexual fetish, and I would strongly recommend that the committee read submission 273 in this regard. And then there are the mounting stories of female athletes who are losing out on places, awards, and opportunities to biological males. It is important to ensure that those who feel disconnected from their biological sex are treated with care and respect. But this cannot be achieved by removing hard-won rights and protections for women. Most of those citing this bill will never be in the position of one of society's most disadvantaged women, serving time in prison or seeking refuge in a shelter. They will likely never be at risk of being cornered by a sexual abuser, in a place that was meant to keep them safe. But they do have a responsibility to protect those women, and they also shoulder a responsibility for the consequences should they fail to do so. I ask that the committee listen to the voices of women, that you take seriously the countless stories of harm, and that you have the courage to stand up against this ill-conceived legislation. Thank you.
Laura?
Thanks, Chair. Thank you. Thank you for your appearance today and for your written submission. I understand from both your oral submission then and your written submission that you're completely opposed to Part 5 in the bill. Could you talk me through any other amendment or anything that could be incorporated in the bill that might allow for the LGBTI community to self-identify in relation to their gender? And I'll premise that by saying accepting the concept of gender and sex as two different things, just for the context of your answer.
Yes, I think the comments that I think might be Sandy who made on via video conference just before is something that we could accept as an appropriate compromise in this situation. So to keep the very important concept of a birth record, which is a factual document that that is very important for obviously data collection and for keeping that record of that person's biological sex. But there could, for example, be a certificate which acknowledges a gender identity, which, as we understand, is obviously subject to change and is not something that's immutable and based in biology or science.
Sandy?
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, and thank you for your submission. You did recommend the creation of gender-neutral spaces as a way forward, and that was on page 8. Could you elaborate on this a bit more?
Yeah, so I guess the idea there is that, obviously, as I've said today and in my submission, keeping female single-sex spaces and also male single-sex spaces is incredibly important for the functioning of our society and for the rights, safety and dignity of women and girls in particular. But I see no reason why there cannot be gender-neutral spaces, so spaces where someone who does not feel comfortable going into a sex-based facility that they do not identify with, and often that will be, it may be their biological sex, but it won't be congruent with the gender they identify with. I don't see any issue why there can't be a gender-neutral space for people who fall along that gender identity spectrum that they can access and feel more comfortable in.
And a quick follow-on question, Chair. In Part 5, you wanted removed at the very least, and that Part 12 should also be removed, and that was on your page 8. Can you just quickly just reiterate why?
So Part 5 is obviously the part of the bill that deals with the self-identification.
Yes.
Yep. So I think that's probably quite clear in the sense that we believe it's very important that being able to continue to record a person's sex on their birth certificate and not allowing that to be conflated with gender in practical situations is incredibly important. Part 12, from memory, was in relation to...
I think it was to do with amending the Anti-Discrimination Act.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really important point, the Discrimination Act, because I would say what my ultimate issue is with this law is that it's asking all Queensland residents to potentially ignore what they see with their own eyes, to ignore reality. Is that going to become illegal? I mean, I can correctly sex every single person sitting in this room right now. It's an instinctive, evolutionary, important biological skill. So is that going to be illegal? What's the punishment if we say this person standing in front of me is male, not a woman? This hasn't been covered in any way, not even a substantial way. We're constantly being asked to provide evidence of harm and what could possibly go wrong. There's been no evidence given that men are women. Didn't even start. I mean, the conversation is over there. It's just absurd that it's even gotten to this stage. Like, if you want to have a gender recognition certificate, fine, it's your life, it's your identity, you're welcome to, but there needs to be exemptions in this law that say gender does not exceed the rights of sex, because it is just obliterating reality for every single Queensland resident.
Thank you.
Jonty.
Thank you, and thank you for attending and your submission and for giving voice to certainly a cohort of people who have those views. I was interested in whether you'd had the opportunity to read the response from the department to submissions around some of the issues that you've raised and what your thoughts were on their response.
Were there particular areas you'd like us to comment on?
I guess the issues that you've spoken to, particularly, I guess, where I'm struggling is the reference to evidence that risk of harm will elevate, and their very clear response, and certainly the research I've undertaken myself prior to these hearings has not really unearthed any peer-reviewed critical evidence, certainly media reports and hypothesis, but no tangible evidence that risk has increased when we accept that predatory people are out there in every domain.
Yeah, but predatory men are out there in every domain, but we've had single-sex spaces to protect women for them. Fair Go for Queensland Women's submission detailed the rising number of male inmates who are identifying as women. In 2021, it was 42. In 2022, as of the 30th of June, it was 63. So we're in 2023 right now. It's growing. Now, there's only 800 and something female inmates in prison. So if you put like 80 males into that prison, you've got 10% of the women's prison population that's male. How does the Queensland women's prison system plan on handling that? Do you think that all of those men who are in prison for crimes are telling the truth, or maybe they have ulterior motives?
Have you read the submissions and the
Yes.
department's response around?
Yes, it's nonsense.
Sorry, I'm still going. From services that they, without this legislation, they are already interacting in a space of gender fluidity, and that they have risk assessment procedures already established to support this, and they're not capturing the evidence of harm, and that's not just in Australia. That's across, hundreds of millions of people who are living in countries where this legislation has been in place for some time.
In New Jersey last year, 2 women inmates were impregnated by a male who claims to be a woman.
Just to that point, I'd just like to add that I agree there are definitely jurisdictions where there aren't formal self-ID laws yet, where males are already identifying as women and accessing women's spaces, and there have definitely been problems with that in itself. So there have been obviously the stories I mentioned of sexual assaults occurring and other kinds of harm stemming from that as well. Self-ID laws make it even easier. So at the moment, there's, I think, in some jurisdictions without the actual legislation, there are policies, there are guidelines in place which allow this to happen. For example, I think in the UK that there aren't self-ID laws, but there is that story of the single-sex hospital ward where that woman was raped by a transgender patient who was biologically male, and for an entire year after that, she was disbelieved because, well, no, she couldn't possibly have been raped because there was no man on the ward, and actually it was a biological male who identified as a woman. Now, there was no self-ID law, but there was obviously guidelines and policies that the hospital followed to say that if someone identified as transgender, as a trans woman, they could access that hospital ward. And that's obviously had devastating consequences for that particular woman. But actually creating a law which says, legally speaking, this is a female, that just makes it even easier for those people to access those spaces. And just to be very, very clear, this isn't to say that trans people are predators. This is to say that biological men have patterns of criminality where they are more likely to commit sexual assault as opposed to women. And trans women are biologically male. And there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that because a biological male identifies as a woman, that those patterns of male criminality change in any way. And in fact, there has been data that's come out of the UK to suggest that trans women who are biological males who have gone to prison and have committed sexual offences, there's actually a more concentrated number of those as opposed to the general male population, which is quite interesting. And to your point again, in terms of the data not being available and so on, I mean, I think there is data that's available, but I also think that it has been quite difficult to collect data because a lot of the time it's not collected accurately, which is obviously a big part of the submission that they're making, that once certain guidelines or certain laws are allowed to conflate sex and gender, then we do not have the ability to collect accurate data which shows that this is actually a biological male's crime and so on.
We're closely on time, but Jason, I understand you may have a question?
I do, yeah. Given all the limitations, Rachael, that you've just talked about with the collection of data, within Australian jurisdictions, the states that have already done work in this space, how many incidents have you narrowed down of a transgender person committing a sexual assault in a designated safe space?
One is enough. One is enough.
Yeah, so how many?
The problem is that when you allow anybody to change their sex marker, it's being recorded as a female crime. It's not being recorded as a trans crime. It's being recorded as a female crime. So where is your data collection?
Yeah, so just to go back to the question, how many do we know of at the moment?
I'm actually uncertain as to how many there are because it's very difficult to get that data. There have certainly been allegations in Victoria of for example, a trans-identified male who was a trans woman raping a woman in a prison there. That's happened multiple times. But again, it is very difficult to collect the data. And to that point, obviously sexual assault is one of the most extreme forms of harm that can come from this legislation. But there's obviously a very wide spectrum of harm to particularly women and girls, which ranges from the very extreme of rape, but goes right down to just not feeling comfortable to actually go and use what should be a single-sex space and then sort of actually being excluded from society in that sense because, you know, you don't want to have to face that kind of intimidation.
Okay, so coming and thank you. That's an excellent answer. But just confirming at this point in time, and it may well be due to difficulties in data collection, we don't have a concrete example that we can point to that at this time or at this place, X offence transpired. Is that?
We're happy to send it through the information to you.
At this point in time, I don't know of an exact number, but certainly we can try to send through more examples of specific occurrences. One interesting point that I will note is that I think it was last year a Freedom of Information request was done in relation to a women's prison in Victoria. Obviously, Victoria does have self-ID laws. And what came back from that is that they're not actually recording the sex of the prisoners that go into a female prison. So we know that there's at least one trans-identified male, so a trans woman who's in a women's prison there. We're pretty sure there's more as well because we've seen media reports, but they're not actually recording the sex of those people. And so if that person was to actually rape or assault a female prisoner, there would be no record of that being a male crime, of that being a transgender crime even, because those details are not being recorded, which is obviously extremely concerning.
Okay, so there could conceivably be dozens or exactly zero.
Well,
or none.
Well, it's unlikely there's zero because there are already stories of it happening, but we don't know how many. It could be dozens. It could be more.
Is there a contention then that an offender would go through the process and then they're not insignificant processes, but an offender would go through the processes of changing their identity, their gender identity, specifically to commit an offence?
Yeah, I mean, predatory men
Could they not commit the offence without going through the process?
Predatory men have always gone to great lengths to get close to victims. They used to dedicate their lives to theology to do it. They'll go to going and getting a piece of paper to say that you're a female is essentially nothing in comparison of what has historically been known to happen. They can train as police officers, a bunch of different things, but to try and mitigate the harm of that, we've had single-sex spaces. This takes away that and allows the predatory men into the single-sex spaces that were a protection from the predatory men.
Exactly, and to your point, obviously a man could go into those spaces, but there's at least the understanding that they're not meant to be there. So it makes it a lot easier if they're then legally just able to claim that that's their space as well.
That brings to a conclusion this part of the hearing. I understand that you have taken a question on notice in relation to the data in relation to offences committed. Would you be able to provide that information by the 31st of January at 5 p.m?
No problem.
To the Secretariat, please?
On that note, Chair, could we also, Sal also mentioned some statistics to do with prison data that have been collected by Fair Go for Queensland Women, and some of that may be in her submission, but we might like to provide a little bit of extra data in relation to that as well.
Yeah, anything to do with the data question will be welcomed by the committee.
Thank you very much.